Okay, everybody who decides to ever watch this and explore the world of microbiome, am I saying that right, microbiome? Because we don't have
Microbiome, biome.
microbiome. And this is called outside the colony. And I've said this on a few occasions, but I keep kind of saying it just for the purpose of perspective and mentality and culture and identity, that we step outside of conventional thinking. Not all the time, because we need to talk to the professionals, but the whole idea would be outside the colony would be take that bigger picture look at things, stepping away from settled labels and traveller league table. So we're joined with a professor from Cork who has studied this particular branch of science. I'm going to guess it's a branch of science that came off the back of geneticists. Are we giving them credit or too much credit?
Too much credit.
Too much. We'll come to that also later. I've no doubt about it. But I'm going to hand you over straight away because I keep talking. That's my problem. We're joined with a wonderful gentleman, of course, Dylan Foley, archaeologist based here in Sligo with myself, and we've been working on a number of projects. But we're joined with Fergus Shanahan from Cork University. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and I'll hand it over to yourself. Tell as much as you possibly can. I will remind you that you did get a certificate 10 years ago for being the Scientist of the Year. 10 years this year. And that was by the Science Foundation of Ireland, I believe. And yeah, so.
So Bernard and Dylan and to all your listeners, thank you for inviting me to come on your show, your program. So my name is Fergus Shanahan. I'm what's called a professor emeritus in the Department of Medicine in University College Cork. I'm originally from Dublin, and what we're going to talk about is the microbiome. Now that's just a relatively new word, and people used to use the word microflora. But microbiome is the generally accepted word now. And what it means is it's a single collective word to describe all of the living creatures in and on the human body. Now, by that, I mean, we're talking about microbes, bacteria, viruses, in and on the human body. So when we're born, we're essentially sterile. We're born without any bugs, any microbes. But as we go into this planet, this world, we become colonized with bacteria and viruses, and indeed yeasts, fungi. And people didn't pay much attention to those in the old days. We didn't have a good way of studying them. We weren't able to culture them. But genetics came to the rescue in this sense. It provided us with the tools to be able to study all these bacteria. And that's the new science of the microbiome. That's all that word means. We have a way now of identifying these microbes on your skin, in your nose, in your lungs, but most of them are actually in your intestine, in your gut. So most of the work has been done on the gut microbiome. Much less is known about microbes in other body cavities, but they're everywhere and they're in all of us, everyone. There is no one on the planet without all of this. And for the last 20 years, we've been studying them, and they are associated with health. We require them for health. They actually help our digestion. They support our immune system, and they support our metabolism. So they are a health asset. They're not something to be squeamish about or anything like that. And it turns out that most of the studies that have been done around the world, and this is a very hot area of science, most of the studies done around the world have been done in Western countries, Western Europe, industrialized countries like Ireland, wealthy countries, and generally within those countries, the studies have been performed in fairly affluent people, usually people working in laboratories, usually students at universities or high schools, and generally limited to the majority of a population in every country. And it's become clear that that only accounts for a small proportion of the number of humans on the planet. And as we start to study other ethnic groups, such as modern hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, there's a group called the Hadza tribe. They're in Tanzania, and they are like our ancestors from centuries ago. They are hunter-gatherers. So they survive moving around. They're nomadic. And they have a very, very different microbiome to what we'd ever seen in Ireland or in North America. And the more you look then at some of these unusual groups, there is a Mongolian horseman. They're also nomadic. And they have this unusual non-industrialized kind of microbiome, the kind of microbiome you see also in Tibet and in certain areas, Peruvian farmers. They're not nomadic, but they're isolated from the rest of society generally. And they have a microbiome that is now felt to be the kind of one that most of us would have had centuries ago, what our ancestors had. And the belief now is that with a modern lifestyle, modern diets, and all the elements of a modern lifestyle, which include things like cities, consumption of drugs, medications, antibiotics, vaccination, smaller family size, sedentary activity, less mobility, refrigeration. I could name them all off. You know, anything you can think of seems to have an influence on your microbiome. And you can tell now from studying the microbiome, who is from an industrialized society and who's not. So I had always wanted to study the Irish travelers. I was naive in the sense that I simply thought that Irish travelers had a lifestyle that I suspected might have been not too distant from what everyone's ancestors were like. And obviously they've been a traveling community going back for centuries. I'm not trying to say that they were identical to the settled community, but there are many of the elements of a traveler's lifestyle today that would be somewhat similar to what my ancestors. I'm from the settled community. And that was the naive thinking. So I was curious about Irish travelers. I didn't have any funding to study them. This is expensive kind of work to do. But I did work with a philanthropist who also was interested in culture and history and provided some financial support to do the study. So I went and met with some of the leaders of the traveller community in the Cork region, in the city of Cork and also North Cork. And surprisingly, they did not think I was daft when I told them what I wanted to do. They listened, and I was conscious, and they were quick to tell me that they've a certain element of research fatigue. There've been lots of people have come and gone and studied Irish travellers and never did anything after that, and it didn't transfer into any policy change that helped the health and welfare of travellers. Now, I couldn't guarantee that we'd find anything that would be useful, but I did guarantee that if we found anything bad, we would certainly inform the travellers, let them know of the results, and keep them informed. And actually, it worked out much better than that. The travellers in Cork, and it's called the Traveller Visibility Group in Cork City, actually discussed with me the design of the study, how we'd go about doing this. Because what we wanted to get was all the health details of at least 100 travellers. We wanted to get them to come in for whole body scans. We got their lean body mass, their fat mass. We wanted blood samples. And we also wanted to get a fecal sample, a stool sample. Now, that might sound like something simple, but it's actually not. You try asking people for a fecal sample and they'll give you anything else, blood, you name it. But you know, fecal sample is logistically, it's embarrassing. It's not straightforward. And I spent all my career working with humans and getting samples from various tissue sites and body sites. And remarkably, this study that I'm talking about with the Irish travellers actually turned out to be, I wouldn't say it was easy, but the compliance rate, meaning the turn up, the show rate, the participation rate, was actually the best I've ever had from any group that I've ever studied. Once they bought in and were confident and were part of the study and could see and hear the results coming back, they effectively did the study for me. We did the laboratory part, but they did the collections and the logistics and organization. So it was a real collaboration and what we call engaged research. It couldn't have been done without active assistance. And I'm going to tell you something else in a minute that made all the difference because of this engagement. In any event, I can't be certain as to what I thought we'd find. I was thinking we'd find that there would be, I was hoping we'd find perhaps that we might get an insight to what most people's microbiome might have looked like centuries ago. There were all kinds of reasons that were thrown at me as to why this study would not work. For example, people said, well, you've got to control for nomadism, you've got to control for all of the illnesses that are associated with the travelers. There was an all-Ireland health study that was done on travelers that said that they had a shortened life expectancy, which is horrific and is a scandal unto itself that we can talk about later. But there were a whole load of reasons why people said, oh, who are you going to compare them with? How are you going to do this? We went ahead anyway, and I said we'd like to get 100. We actually got over 100. We got 130 to buy into this, and that's a fairly good sample. And we compared them with 400 of the settled community that we'd studied the same way. And we also had access to data from people in other countries. We had actually 3,000 controls from other countries. So this was a big, big study that, you know, if we were going to fail, we weren't going to fail for technological reasons. We were, you know, we designed it and conducted it very well. And the results were absolutely amazing. And I really mean, I don't normally use that. Most times in science and research, you get these little incremental changes and you inch along. And they were so different. The results with the travelers were so different that we went back and repeated the samples several times to make sure there wasn't some, what we call artifact. There wasn't some error in this. There wasn't some mistake. And we went over it and over it. And the bottom line was that we found a microbiome in the Irish travelers that we'd never seen in Ireland before. We had studied young athletes. We had studied various diseases. We had studied the elderly. We're well known for studying older people in all communities because the microbiome deteriorates when you get older. So we'd done all those kinds of studies. We'd done studies in people taking various medications. We'd done all that, but we'd never seen anything like what we saw in the Irish travelers. In fact, we found organisms, microbes, that we didn't even know existed before. So then we went and compared that with the 3,000 from around the world that had been done in a similar way that have already been published. And it turns out that the microbiome of the Irish travelers is closer to what you'd see in that Hadza tribe I was talking about in Tanzania, and closer to the Mongolian horsemen or the Peruvian farmers than are closer to them than you'd see, say, in North America or Canada or France or the UK. So they are quite distinct. They're not identical to the Mongolians and they're not identical to the Hadza, but what they are is they fall into this category of so-called non-industrialized microbiome, the kind of microbiome you see in people in ancient civilizations. Now, the first observation we made about that was we were aware that travelers had been granted separate ethnic status by the Irish government in 2017, but we were also aware that there were certain politicians who seemed to, well, disparage that or question that or not take it too seriously, perhaps. And there isn't any way of proving your separate ethnic identity. I know that travelers felt they were different, and all that the subjects who worked with us, the volunteers, always told me, well, we feel different. We believe we're different. And they used to comment that a lot of Irish political policy has sort of been, if you will, to make the Irish traveller problem, and I put the word problem in quotes, to make it go away by sort of assimilating the travellers, make them like the settled community, and therefore, you know, just make them like the rest. But the truth is, there was no science that I could find that actually showed rigorously that the travellers are quite distinct. And the microbiome does show that. Now, I want to draw a distinction between human genetics and the human microbiome. The microbiome, remember, is the study of all the microbes that are in and on your body. Genetics is the study of the DNA that was given to you by your parents. So everyone who watches TV nowadays knows that they use forensics. They get your DNA and they're able to tell you who you are. My DNA is different to yours, and yours is different to your it's related to what your parents have, but it's distinct, and you can identify anyone from their DNA or your fingerprint. That tells you who you are, but that doesn't tell you anything about the way you live. The microbiome can also tell you who you are, because everyone's microbiome is distinct. but it tells you what kind of life you've been living, because it's influenced by all of the lifestyle variables. It's influenced by your history, what you've eaten, the medications you've taken, the diseases you've had, the lifestyle you've led. So microbiome is hugely informative in a different kind of way. And when you find a microbiome in the Irish travellers that's quite distinct from the settled community, you've got 21st century science support that the Irish travellers deserve their separate ethnicity. What's more, I suspect, I can't prove this at the moment, Bernard, but I suspect, and I think there's some evidence to support this, that the microbiome of the settled community is the one that's changed. I think the travellers have retained an ancient microbiome. And I do suspect that my microbiome, my ancestors' microbiome particularly, centuries ago, might have looked a bit like a traveller's microbiome, but with modernization and with the settled community, the elements of lifestyle we may not even know about seem to have changed that microbiome. Now, the reason I'm saying that, because when you go and look at ancient, believe it or not, you can get ancient stool. I mean, there's various fecal specimens that have actually been, believe it or not, preserved in permafrost in Siberia and in ancient caves, subterranean caves that have been cut off from the surface. Such studies have been actually done, and they've been done in Europe and in Siberia and in various countries around the world. And when you go study those with these modern molecular tools, you find that the ancient preserved stools are fairly close, very similar to the non-industrialized microbiome that the travelers have. So I think it's the modern lifestyle that has changed the microbiome, and the travelers have held on to it. Now, I suspect also, as traveler culture becomes eroded, and I think it is becoming eroded, some of it's enforced, actually, and much of it is enforced, that I suspect that one very good thing about traveler ethnicity, meaning the health benefits of its microbiome, you're going to start losing. So it's almost like a double whammy for travelers. Enforced lifestyle changes in the name of progress and in the name of maybe facilitating misguided public health policies, perhaps, may actually have some unintended consequences, one of which is the loss of your microbiome. Now, the only piece of evidence I have for that, the reason our study was published in a very prestigious journal called Nature Medicine was not for the reasons I've just told you now. That got their attention, but that would have been published in some obscure science journal, as a lot of science studies are. The reason that it got published in Nature Medicine was we were able to go back and reanalyze our data based on information that the travelers gave to us, because they were involved in the design of the study. So we had enough subjects in our study where we were able to find out, were you nomadic in childhood, or did you live in a house in childhood? And what is your condition now? And we knew that the Health Act of the Housing Act of 2002, which never mentioned travelers, there's no mention of them, and I've read the act, but it effectively forced travelers off the road. And you probably know a lot more about this than I do, but in essence, it ended nomadism. But we had enough subjects where we could say, well, what were you like in childhood long before 2002? And what is your accommodation now? And we found that if you were in a house as a child and still in a house, you've effectively lost your microbiome. It's much like mine and the settled community. But if you were nomadic in childhood, in other words, living what we would regard as the very traditional traveler lifestyle, like the people in the back of your photograph there, if you were nomadic in childhood and now in a halting site, not a house, but in a halting site, you've actually retained your microbiome. If you were nomadic in childhood and have now moved into a house, you've got this intermediate one. So we saw these two groups. We saw the people who were in a house in childhood. They pretty much lost the microbiome. Then there's this intermediate group. And then you have the people who've, if you like, more robustly held on to their travelerhood. And they're the ones with the very unusual, unique microbiome. And that convinced the publishers. And then they commissioned an editorial written not by us, by somebody else, who actually hailed the study and said, this has huge global implications. It's not just about Irish travelers. The Irish travelers showed a story, but it has relevance to any ethnic minority, maybe ethnic migrants, Ukrainians coming to Ireland, or anyone that has this enforced lifestyle change, which will disrupt their microbiome and change and has health implications. And in this case, the value of the traveler study is, the Irish traveler study is, there's no geographic confounders here. We're not studying someone coming from the Ukraine or someone coming from Tanzania to Ireland, a very different geographic location. We're studying people who are actually within 30 kilometers of where I live. So there's no geographic difference that could confound us. You can't criticize the study for that. And we're also studying Irish people. The travelers are Irish, a separate ethnic identity, but they are Irish. And now you've got an example of a non-industrialized microbiome in an industrialized country. There's no other example of that in the literature that has been studied. And that's why this is such an important study. I'm sure other people will now do similar things. But to me, it was I don't want to say it was just a good news story for travelers, but it is a good news story because it's science confirmation of something that is a mirror on your lifestyle and is robust. So I'll stop talking there.
Wow, I wish you wouldn't. That's just, there's lots and lots in there. First, I want to say a big call out to Cork Visibility Group, who are science friendly. We need science friendly organizations, particularly human rights organizations. It's like there was a clash, a war going on between this, I don't want to call it an indigenous bacteria and an industrial bacteria, but there seemed to be a big clash going on there. I was thinking about this last night because after you watch 4.5 YouTube videos, you know it all. But I was thinking about it and I was kind of analyzing in my own mindset how I kind of seen this. And I kind of had it as we as humans right here now are probably not carrying the microbiome and we're not hosting it. But it's actually the reverse, that we're living in a microorganism world.
Yeah.
And we're hosted within that.
Correct.
And I was just kind of looking at it that way because I was thinking about how would it have continued? How would it have lasted? Of course, marginalization and all that will come into play. But I think there's a lot more to it because this bacteria doesn't have a label called traveler. It has absolutely no idea what we're talking about it.
Correct.
And therefore, if we were to go that route, we'd say, well, then once upon a time, it was a tinker bacteria. But if you take away that label, then you'd say it was an itinerant bacteria. But if you take away that label, it'll be wild Irish bacteria. But if you take away that label, then you're into a Gaelic society. So this is where we marry the science of Caviera, is that he gives us a map saying we've done X amount of families. Here is their locations. Here's their fixed spots. And it was what we were saying all along. We were saying we barely traveled. We know travelers who lived in houses for generations. They're still travelers. We know travelers who never left their area, and they're still travelers. So this notion and narrative that was promoted, and again, it was without science. Most of the people are doing this through the 80s and the 90s. I also like about your science, it actually comes through does it come through the mother and not the father?
It comes through both, really, but it primarily comes through the mother. The first wave of bacteria that get onto your body are from your mothers. There is a second wave once you're born, the environment, everything you touch, animals that you're associated with, your father as well. But the first wave, the first bacteria colonizing you are from your mother. That's
interesting in itself. Does other pets play a factor? Because we grew up with a lot of hounds and dogs and all sorts.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Another one.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll hand over to Dylan, and he might have a question or two for you, and then we'll come back again.
Well, not so much a question this time, actually, because we're obviously very interested in that. That research is very interesting to me, speaking from an archaeology point of view, and that, as Bernard would say, that's one of our core things when we're tracking back that history. because we're in agreement, full agreement with you actually in that regard. The idea that kind of the state had for whatever reason had fallen into this idea that had given the impression that the industrial world, or let's say the urban world, was the normal one, and that it gave this idea that it extended into the past forever, and somehow travelers must have always been a subculture of that. And I suppose in archaeology we would say that that's clearly not the case, that right up till almost the 16th century or 17th century, the Irish lived in a rural, dispersed, mostly rural, but a dispersed organization of clans, and with power dispersed across the country, non-urban fundamentally, and in clans that are tightly linked, and in that kind of a world. Up until in European terms, until fairly recent times, right up till mid 17th century, when it all gets devastated. And of course, what we were saying is that to correct that has been difficult without scientific backing, because obviously narratives are just narratives, and you can take evidence and go, well, maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong, this kind of thing. But between, as Bernard had referenced earlier, that I think the research done in the Royal College was had detected slightly different thing. It had detected what they called a divergence at about 400 years ago. Well, between 300 and 460 or something like that, or 360, 420. I can't quite remember, but roughly around the 17th century, exactly when we would expect it. And but the modern frame on that had been given that the travelers had diverged from the settled population. So me and Bernard and others had argued, in the recent times, we've kind of made an argument against that. We were saying that that's not really logical or possible, and that there just wasn't enough of what we would now call settled, as in an urban population. There just wasn't enough people living that way. They were only confined to the area around Dublin and other small parts of the country, and that the divergence doesn't make much sense. So what you're saying, that actually what we would expect is very simple. Is in the 17th century, Gaelic society is broken down. The conquest happens, as we know, after the Battle of Kinsale, near where you are, and we expect a flood of basically a large. We know what happened. A large amount of people come in from Britain and from the East in general, and from Scotland and everywhere else, and the population gets mixed, and we get urbanization and everything that leads to the modern Ireland, and that's fine, but we know that's the history. And so we wouldn't expect a divergence. What we'd expect is that as they intermarry and get linked, and people settle, as we call it in Ireland, and move into move to where the forts are, or forcibly actually stopped and made to live in the towns, the new towns, and that we would expect exactly the same process that you're seeing, in the sense that a large portion of the Irish population would now, and I presume you can see it in their gut biome, that they would now move towards an industrial or an urban societal norm, like the rest of Europe, I guess, to some extent, or maybe.
And that's Dylan, that's actually what's being seen in a few studies in North America, where migrants from the old world, in general, that would be South Asia, southern parts of Asia, and parts of Mexico, where they migrate into the United States, and they, in general, tend to adopt the new world. They go to the movies, they're eating hamburgers, they're changing. The age at which you migrate seems to influence what happens to your microbiome. The younger the younger the age, the more likely you'll be exposed to this new microbiome in the industrialized world. And with that comes your risk of diseases associated with the industrialized world. And I'm talking about chronic inflammatory and metabolic diseases. I'm talking about things like extreme asthma. I'm talking about certain skin diseases, certain forms of arthritis, certain forms of bowel disease that were not common in the old world. Whereas what you were saying there is, but it is the settled community that have actually adopted modernization with almost aggression. And I think it's the travelers who've tried to hold on to their ancient ways. And I'll come to why I think they've managed, why I think it's relevant to the microbiome. I'll come to that in a moment. But yeah, it's actually the shift has been in the settled community, not in the traveler community. And even in my lifestyle, in my lifetime, I mean, I can recall as a youngster, you know, my parents were from a rural background and farming, but I can recall travelers being more, I won't say integrated, but more close to the settled community. It was quite commonplace for travelers to do seasonal work on a farm with the time of the harvest. My uncles used to take on travelers who'd be nomadic, but they'd come along in September and they would help with the harvest, and they would do odd jobs and things, and then they'd move on. But that was quite a normal, accepted way of life. And I think that's become less evident now. Maybe because farming becoming more mechanized, maybe because farmers, there's fewer of them now, maybe because the change in the type of farming they're doing, I don't know. But I have this impression that travelers are not as close to the settled community as they at least were back a couple of generations ago. You'd be able to answer that better than I would, but that's my impression.
I would say to that, you're spot on again. Because we have recordings, my granduncle and various older travelers passed away now, all of them, and they all talked about the relationship they had with the settled people, the country people. They called them. They didn't call them settled people.
Yeah,
they called them the country people.
Country people, yeah.
Yeah, and they'd go out to the country people's houses, and the doors would be open. They'd walk in, they'd walk out, they'd sit down, they'd tea, they'd work, they'd do all of them. Now this is in Mayo and Sligo and places like that. I've heard travelers say it from Cork to Donegal, all the same messages.
Yeah.
So something happened. And I'm sure you're familiar with the report of the Commission into Itinerancy in 1963. Leading up to that, this is why I think people might get a sense of why travelers have so many psychological challenges today, is because it resulted, well, it was ongoing prior to that with other attempts from 1922. If I was to put into people's head that in 1922, the Irish state never changed one English colonial institution, and I mean not one of them, there was no real formation, or all there was a continuation with the threat of war within 3 days if they didn't accept them. That's what happened. Systematically, as you said, there was a shift. Settled people are becoming more modernized. But there's ancient old laws that made settled people under English rules, such as the Vagrancy Acts that goes back centuries. So there is that divide. But so 1963, this was the same year John F. Kennedy was in Ireland, the Beatles were in Ireland, Gabe Byrne had his first Late Late Show. These were the documentaries I was hoping to do if I ever got funding. But in the 1960s, something did happen. And it was without travellers knowing. Itinerants, they were calling us, and tinkers, dim times. So I'd say I wasn't born then, but we felt it, we experienced it. So we had no idea what was going on. We didn't understand settled people, particularly in Dublin anyways, because we weren't used to Dublin, whatever about the country people. But what we didn't know was there was going out in the media and was going out on the national radio channels was there was going to be an assimilation process, that these people were going to be absorbed into the settled population. We were the only ones that didn't know about it. Everybody else knew about it, from Postman Pat right across the board. They knew, but what happened then was that the state started encouraging people to go out and spy on people, to find out who's an itinerant, who's a tinker, what's their habits, where did it go, who did put in names. So this collection was happening, and it created this divide of suspicion. Automatically, we became the other. So villages and towns we were so used to coming and going to were now feeling different. People were suspecting us that we were disease carriers. These were the things that were being said about us. And we were carrying filth, and we were thieving and robbing and stealing. So all these things started to muster up over time. So generation after generation grew up with their parents and their granny telling them about the tinkers because they heard it on the radio. Their friend told them. Of course, in the 80s, it went berserk. It broke into all kinds of violence. Travellers were being attacked in camps, camps being burned, houses being burned, caravans being burned. Children were industrialized, they were taken into segregated care homes. Now, think about that in a Western world in the 1960s, where it was happening in colonial America, Australia, and New Zealand. Children snatched and the itinerant was beaten out of them and mangled up in all this system. And nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody wants to address it. So we're here now and today, and there's travellers, children, young as 9 years old, taking their lives because they're being bullied sometimes over their ethnicity, their identity. So if things had changed in 1922 and Connolly and all them guys got their Gaelic wishes, then people would know who we were. People wouldn't be shocked by us, or these nomadic clans and these people who arrange fights and these people who arrange weddings and these people do all these things that all the Gaelic culture was doing. But what's happening in Ireland, what's been happening behind me here, is that you're looking at what the English did to your ancestors. The Irish are doing it to the Irish. It isn't in assimilation, it's colonization at a psychological level that we need to become normal, like the settled, because that's the way the English had created it. Now, I've been on a bit of a rant here, so I'm going to stop.
Well, I think actually the word I wrote down while you were talking there, it was you're fighting ignorance. Ignorance as in the sense of a lack of familiarity and a failure to understand why differences are so important. Now, I have shown the story of our research in the United States. I've shown it to other scientists because they were interested. I mean, I've presented at Johns Hopkins, at UCLA, at various different scientific meetings, and they're always fascinated. But every time someone says to me, but they look the same as you, and they say something, they basically want to say, but they're not black, or they're not blue, or they look the same as you. And they can't understand why there would be such discrimination. If travelers were any different color, I think, it's such a national scandal, the discrimination. And I can't think of another word other than racism. It's ethnic bias, it's ignorance, but it's the same as naked racism. I couldn't agree with you more. I think the ignorance is the misguided policies of assimilation. Melting pots don't work. Making people all the same, to make the problems go away, if you call them problems, never works. What does work is celebrating the differences. I mean, for example, as an Irish person, I was only just talking about it today about Polish people and Ukrainians coming to Ireland and people from Nigeria and various other countries and people from India, actually. And I was remarking that how good they are at cricket and why Ireland is a bit of has become fairly good at cricket. I never knew we were any good at that now, but it's because these people coming in. The point is, I don't want them to come in and be like the Irish. We've plenty of Irish. I want them to come in and be themselves and enrich the place. So the same should be with the travellers. Trying to make the travellers like the settled community is actually daft. It's completely misguided. But I think when I went, I wouldn't have known this until I started doing the studies and went back and looked at all the legislation. It wasn't just the Housing Act of 2002. There have been several pieces of legislation going way back since the foundation of the state, actually, that while it wouldn't necessarily mention travellers, the net effect was to make it more difficult to have a horse, more difficult to move around. All these things actually conspired to make it far more difficult to be a traveller.
I will say briefly, I'm going to hand this straight off to Dylan, is that, it's a form of ignorance, but I'm under the, we process a lot of this kind of stuff because I grew up without any formal education. I left school early. But I was very, very curious about settled mentality and traveller mentality. What made us different? Like when you're a child in a classroom at the back of the class and taught you don't need an education, you keep horses, you collect scrap. You have a lot of time to think. So I was always thinking about these different mentalities and over and backs and so on and so forth. We don't see ourselves genetically different from any human being. We understand there's genetic markers that divides one thing or another. Eye complexion, skin complexion, lovely heads of hair like mine, stuff like that. Minor stuff, minute stuff. But what was happening was, it wasn't even ignorance, because I think the settled people are the people that were impoverished. They were the people who were denied access and information of their old systems of the Gaelic world. They got very limitation. I'm sure I've spoken to several people, highly educated people in universities, and they're telling me they won't find it. I had a guy on there a while back called Aldous Reed Jr., an American political scientist, wonderful African-American chap. And he was telling me that the learned people in Ireland were trying to convince him that travellers were related to Roma, and he told them where to go, this kind of stuff. So I think it's not even ignorance, and it's not blame, and it's no more about shame. And this is a process that's been going on for centuries. It's systematic, and it's also subconscious. And I think the majority of the settled people are not even aware of it. They were never taught about it in school, about their state, where it came from, the institutions, that all their Irish laws lead back to Westminster, their education goes back to Westminster, their land rights goes back to Westminster. If people were conscious of that stuff, well, then they wouldn't have thought, well, we're the normal Irish and the travellers are something different. But we're saying we're coming from a different school of thought, a different world, your old world we're coming from. So I'm hoping that with TraVision Foundation is creating that. I would say to tell your friend, a philanderer, to get back onto you, that you're just at the edge of this. Because if our shit is that good, imagine what our brains will be like.
Well, there's one question you haven't asked me, and it is, why do I think travelers have managed to retain this ancient microbiome? And since you haven't asked me, I'm going to tell you anyway.
Most certainly it was on the list of things. But
okay, no, I know that. I know that. I mean, the true answer is I don't know. But what we did find was, what were the three things that correlated with this? Everyone, when I present this information, people usually said, yeah, it's their diet, isn't it? It's something to do with their diet. And that's the usual explanation, because diet has a powerful effect on your microbiome, because the food you eat, it influences the growth of the microbes. So that's a reasonable thing to suspect. But in actual fact, we had very good dietary information from the people who were in the study, from both the settled community and from the traveller community. And we had it for the controls that were previously published as well. Diet doesn't explain it. Clearly does not explain it. I'm not saying diet is unimportant. I'm just saying it doesn't explain this issue in Ireland, the difference between travellers and the others. And the only three things we could find. Now, it may be that we didn't ask the right questions, but of the things we studied and asked, number one, the size of the family. The average number of siblings, the average number of children in the family, in the traveller families we studied, was 10. 10 kids in the family. So large families, were something that the settled community had at one stage. They no longer. The average number of children, according to the census now, in the rest of the society is 1.38, whereas our traveller families, it was 10. So that correlated with this ancient microbiome. The second thing that correlated was, what were you doing as a child? If you were nomadic as a child, that jumped out. Now, it's not about moving around. I don't think that's the thing that makes it. It's the lifestyle you have when you are moving around. Because to move around, you have to be in a caravan or something like that, a trailer, like in the photograph behind you. You have to live in a big family, living in close quarters. So you're exchanging microbes. You're closer to each other. You're more likely to retain your microbes. Whereas if you're rattling a house around in a new house with your 1.3 siblings, you're less likely to share the microbes with each other. And I can remember growing up where the mother in the family would, with a big family, you put the first one into when you were bathing them once a week, maybe one into the pot, move them on, the next one into the same thing, and people would sleep in the same bed. But if you have only 1.3 sibs in the house, you're not likely to sleep in the same bed. So you're not living in close quarters. So I think proximity, humans to humans, contact was the second thing we found. And the other big thing was, and we asked questions about all aspects of modern lifestyle, by the way. We asked about birth and exposure to antibiotics and all kinds of things, and a detailed story about the diet. But the third thing was exposure to animals as a child, and particularly horses. But it wasn't limited to horses, but particularly domestic pets and animals in close proximity, particularly in your younger age. Lots of people get horses and cats and dogs later on, but it's when you were a child. They were the three things. So it was the animals, it was living in close quarters, which is a proxy for nomadism, and the size of your family. They were the things. They're traditional things that travelers have. Now, there's probably lots of others, but we didn't manage to capture those.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about one or two things here quickly. Was that the pattern of travelers in terms of, say, to take the caravans behind me? Well, that would have been a clan. That would have been, and then dim generations, and some of them children grow up and they go into institutions, some of them become settled people. That's what happens. It's just, that's how we're divided psychologically, more so. But they would have a very long history going back, deeper into that environment where this microbiome would be very normalized. It would be widespread, maybe. So that would be one. So, of course, the horse is another factor. Then there are a lot of travelers, surprisingly, again, where disease carriers, and yet, or the opposite, is that we're unhygienic. Because we lived in very, very appalling conditions sometimes. But internally, within the home,
by the way, I should just knock that in the head. We found no evidence for that. In actual fact,
well, the reason that you won't find evidence for it is because this is the part where a lot of people don't see. It's a traveler buy gallons of bleach, and they're non-stop in that hygienic mode, and they've got different pots and different pans and different cans for different kinds of washing.
And that's one of the things that I thought would actually throw off the study. That traveler women, the matriarch, the mother in the family, is exactly as you said, cleaning the whole place and bleaching the place and like hygiene, super conscious. It had nothing to do with hygiene, and so that, in fairness, I've not heard anyone claim that, but we certainly found the opposite. That hygiene was not related. There is a thing called the hygiene hypothesis. People think that hygiene has been the reason why settled community have lost their microbiome. That actually has been shown to be false. It's wrong. It has nothing to do with hygiene. It's something else in lifestyle, but it's nothing to do with hygiene.
Would you have found similar microbiome in, say, rural areas?
You find, if you will, a more diverse, a better microbiome amongst farmers, people living in rural areas, but it's nothing like as good, as diverse, as unique as the traveler microbiome. Wow. So rural is better than urban. There's no doubt, and other people have found that. But traveler trumps all of that again.
So you do have this ancient bacteria on your hands.
Oh yeah, there is this difference between rural and urban for sure.
Wow.
And I suppose urban really means you've more aggressively adopted a modern lifestyle, perhaps. I don't quite know. I suppose living in an urban area, you're living on concrete, you have less exposure to nature. You're living indoors mainly, less exposure to the outdoor flora and fauna. There's probably lots of different elements that go into the difference between urban versus rural.
Yeah, where a lot of travelers
that doesn't explain the unique nature of travelers.
You might find that a lot of travelers didn't have the same level of exposure to a settled environment, or the discrimination from hotels, shops, barbers, whatever. So they weren't in that environment as much because.
Yes.
Yeah, interesting.
So you can track. Yeah. So it sounds to me like it's tracking more towards and I mean it's confirming kind of what. Or let's say it's heading in the direction of what we're saying, that we're talking about if it's unique, then we're also talking about something that may well have come across as this community became more and more urbanized and stuff, that travelers had retained from the medieval, let's say at least from the Middle Ages, the older way of life.
Dylan, sorry not to cut across you, but before we used those terms industrialized and non-industrialized, and by the way, for our study, we used the United Nations definition. They've got a definition of what is an industrialized and not. They're fairly obvious, but there is a set definition. But before those words were used, microbiome scientists were using the term ancestral microbiome. In other words, the microbiome of a traveler, they would recognize to be ancestral. and that's the way they refer to this, the Hadza tribe in Tanzania, and to the Mongolian horsemen. They use that term ancestral. We accept it's ancestral, and we just moved it on. It tracks closer to industrialization or non-industrialization. Yeah.
So I mean, that's fascinating. So it's exactly what we'd see in terms of archaeology, or even that we'd be looking more like the houses themselves.
Yes.
The old cottages, even, for example, where you start to isolate people in cottages, stone cottages in the 17th and 18th century are actually called English houses to start with, because they're not the sort of the wattle huts that people were more mobile and were more people were able to move, were easier to construct and move, kind of thing. And that was typical of the older society, where people had a routine of, it's sort of, we'd probably call it semi-nomadic from what we're piecing together, because we get into a lot of confusion, which is more to do with the states, with the English states originally kind of saying these people are nomadic and we can take their land for that reason. That's a separate question to how people's actual life was, as you know, which is an ancient tradition of rural farming, and pastoralism. So the Irish were very close to the animals in that regard, going back, if we go back to 16th century and beyond, bringing the cattle up the hills and the mountains up to higher pastures in the summer and moving them back down in the winter. I think we were just looking at something yesterday, Bernard, where they were saying the villages, an English eyewitness saying that the villages are in the autumn are almost as big as in the spring. In other words, the villages changed in size during the year, and as people move with cattle and horses up to the high pastures and then came back down to settle themselves down for the winter, kind of thing. But that proximity to horses is really interesting, because that obviously certain parts of the society have more connection to horses than others. Those that are moving for various reasons, those that are maybe soldiers, those that are involved in more long-range expeditions, that kind of thing. And actually, you had a little bit of status to have horses and stuff like that in the older society. And but we do know, I mean, that kind of if you're going back further into this kind of that ancient thing, I mean, all the way back, and I know it's something that needs to be explored even in the present day, the link to horses, the pressure, as we know in Tipperary and places, the pressure to split the travellers from their horses, to not allow them. I think I saw a law where it was to not allow, and this is very fascinating what you were saying about the exposure in youngsters, because one of the main missions I saw of the horse laws, and only I think in 2006 or something, was it, Bernard, something like that?
1996 it could be.
96 was to stop them owning horses from under the age of 16, for example. And that's really interesting to me, because I was looking at it thinking, often when we see laws like that, we look at the law to see what was really happening. And I would say that if there's a law saying you can't have horse under 16, that means people are being given horses under 16, if you know what I mean. And it must be part of the tradition. And so you're saying that the unique biome is possibly linked to that, to children. And we know in traveller communities are often looking after horses, or even have horses they're looking after themselves from a very young age, from the age of 6 or 7 or onward, because the tight connection to horses goes back. I mean, we actually know it goes back thousands of years, and the genetic, I've seen genetic studies where they're starting to try and open up those links, that kind of even as clans are linked, as clans, genealogies are kind of done, and even let's say in the old poets used to do the genealogies, the genealogy of horses would be parallel to it almost.
When we found these results, I just saw that the science was telling us that the microbiome of Irish travellers was similar but not the same as people in Mongolia. I didn't know anything about it, so if you put into Google just Mongolia and go look at some images, you actually see people living in close quarters, horses all over the place, and they've got these yurts, like they're like tents, but they're not in trailers or wagons, but they're in these close quarters. You could transfer that to Ireland and call them travellers. I mean, it's different, but it's not totally dissimilar to the
No.
traditional life of a traveler. But horses really feature quite a bit there.
Yeah, that's
And
quite.
I think it's more than just microbiome, of course. I think the horse is almost iconic. My favorite photograph, my favorite piece of art in the Cork University Hospital was actually produced by a traveler woman. And it's this fantastic tapestry, multicolored, just eye-catching, stunning, actually, of a horse. Wow. And you see it in a lot of the art that travelers produce. So I suspect the horse is important for everything from mental health to identity to it's almost it's there's more to it than just a utility animal or anything like that. You know, the horse is
I
almost
think you remember the Tipperary the big controversy because the traveller families wouldn't move into beautiful fancy houses without their horses, and this caused a shockwave among all the people, as if it was a goldfish in a jar and you didn't want to go in without it. So that bond, that tightness.
So unnecessary quick question, too, because it's
a quick question because I can pop up and make because I need to remember things. There is other people on the island with a very, very, very long generational connection with horses, but are actually settled people, we said. And this would be sometimes the inner city lads in Dublin who have got horses also generational. So I'm wondering, was there any research done there, or is it a possibility in the future maybe?
No, that's actually something we want to study. You know, you'd like to study, you've got to control for a lot of things because there's all sorts of opposing influences, you know. If you've got someone who's taken loads of antibiotics as a child, that would neutralize, that kills off the bacteria, that would neutralize certain things. So, you know, I'm not saying horses are the only thing involving this microbiome, but I would like to study, for example, you know, in some of these stud farms, the groomsmen are the people looking after the closest to the horses. Not just he jumps up on his back and rides them every now and again, every Sunday or something, but actually who's shoveling the shit and in there and helping the horse and grooming it and all that, really close to the horse. They would be the kind of people I'd like to study. We don't have good data to answer your question, but I think it'll end up being more. I doubt we'll find people who have a microbiome that's very close to the traveler simply because of exposure to horses. I think the traveler microbiome is one that there's more layers to this. There's been more influences built up over the centuries that have contributed to this unusual microbiome. But to answer your question, we don't have the data yet.
Is there an interest from, say, government, state, or being organizations, particularly when you're dealing with one of the most oppressed communities in Europe, according to European commissions themselves, that this would be also a human rights issue, that this deserves and needs to be further researched and analysed and so on? Are you met with resistance or welcoming?
Well, I'd make two statements. The first one is, when we found this, we did want to publicize it and disseminate the information, mainly to the traveller community, but also to the settled community, because it could be argued that this is more important for the non-traveller community than it is for the travellers. I mean, it's important for everyone. But the big interest came from outside the country. I've been interviewed by all kinds of groups, but all from outside the country. Very few of the journalists picked up on this. Very few of them were interested. And I'm sad and ashamed to say that the settled community have not adopted this with great interest. There's obviously exceptions. On the other hand, I have to say that although Science Foundation Ireland did not fund the study, and I hadn't asked them for funding, I didn't ask them explicitly. I got that from philanthropy, but they did agree to fund. They gave a small grant to us to help disseminate it. So we've made a small YouTube video. We've gone into the schools in Cork. We've used their money to get the information out. We've a leaflet that describes the study that I can send you copies. I'll send you stuff by email. And I have a book coming out on the microbiome, done in graphics, done in imagery, not in words, not in prose, but it's kind of like from the microbes perspective.
That's not the language of illness that came out a couple of years ago.
No, that's a few years ago.
It's flying off the chart.
Yeah, this one will be called "Listen to Your Microbes." This is. I'll send you a copy when it comes. It's in press. It'll probably be launched sometime in October, but it'll only take you 20 minutes to read it. It's mainly just images. It's not dumbed down. It's just trying to present complex information in an accessible way. and the travellers feature there.
That's one
The
of the
Science
key
Foundation
things.
Ireland have supported the dissemination of the information once they saw it and realised that this was important. But it's a hard slog. I mean, it's getting the word out.
I'd say that's partly. I mean, we've done many interviews on that, but I'd say that partly the slog is because it's not in the right framework. That history is kind of a little bit, and I'm going to
The wrong way around, unfortunately.
Yeah, when we have the narrative isn't quite right, we think so, and like from what we're talking, we're agreeing on this narrative. It makes perfect sense to us. But because as we know, the way the 63 report, they left history out on purpose. It wasn't involved. Everything was going to be modernized, and without even judging it all, this is what happened. I think that as you correct the story in the past, I think it'll become much easier for people to see why this is so important and so relevant.
Just on that, Fergus, I don't want to get you into too much trouble with the geneticist crowd. I don't want to start a clan battle between you. But Caballero has it, and we've talked to him, we spoke to him, we're hoping to get him on sometime, and we will. And hopefully a panel with all you great minds together so I can cause trouble with you all. But listening to you and what you're saying, and we absolutely absorbed it, as in it just makes so much sense to what we've been saying so long about environment, where we came from, where we didn't come from. But Caballero has on his science, and not questioning the science, because we don't know enough about science to be questioning it, but the narrative. So on his science paper, at the very top of that, he would say Irish travellers had diverged from the settled population approximately this time. But it sounds like you're saying that wouldn't be possible because that bacteria didn't come from an industrial settled background. It came elsewhere. Am I trying to cause trouble or what?
No, you're not causing trouble. And incidentally, I have very good relations with that science group in Royal College of Surgeons. And in fact, we quote his work.
We do
in
too.
Our paper, we do quote the
We've
work.
Got so much in common.
and we quote that piece of information. But I actually think he's actually not saying all Irish travellers diverged. He's saying that there have been different waves of travellers. We really don't know. I mean, there's records of nomadic groups in Ireland going way back, long before Cromwellian times. It's often said, oh, well, the travellers are just displaced settled community from Cromwellian times. That's nonsense. So
actually,
he's doing...
the label traveller, it's like, you could also say it's like microbiome. The reason is because it isn't one thing. It's a very complex network of different peoples, different backgrounds. Some fell in, some fell out, some came from the top, some arrived from the bottom. So it's a gateway to that kind of world. It's very diverse in itself.
Just to clarify, we're not disputing any of what they said with the genetics. What we would say is we think the microbiome is more important than the genetics, but that's just scientific snobbery. But no, we're just saying both things can be true. But the big divergence was the settled community adopting modernization, whereas the travelers really reflect what our ancestral microbiome probably looked like, because they retained their ancient ways.
And so I'm going to put my hand up and let everyone off the hook by saying it's entirely historians' fault that that they haven't made it clear. They haven't made it very clear that narrative of what happened in the past in terms of travellers. They didn't do study. They went along with the 63 thing of denying that they should look at the history of travellers in the country and the history of the settled community. More importantly, were left completely out of any of it, as if there was no question about where they came from. And it's actually that kind of blank space where the settled community, it's just accepted that they just exist, if you know what I mean. And that's the way it is. And everything has remained, and it gives you this idea that everything's remained the same into the past. That's historians' fault. I'm going to take that as being straight up. Now, we all know it's all bound up with...
But you identify as an archaeologist, so you're throwing the historians under the bus.
I'm going to blame them, right? No, but the archaeology, I'm including archaeologists now as well.
Because hang on too long with the travellers, my friend.
Yeah, but they haven't. No, it's in that department. It has to be fixed there, because that little part of it, and then all the science makes sense, I think, because it's all fits perfectly with what we're talking about. The history is very straightforward. What we're really dealing with is perceptions in the present. We all know that there was a conquest and it happened in the past and all that kind of stuff, but the present perceptions of of identity, and the fact the English built the state, but we're not supposed to talk about it. And the laws that we used, as me and you have done talks on this, but I think this is very relevant because that the laws were kept, but those laws actually were designed at a time where they were designed to stop that way of life from happening. They were designed to split people from their traditional movement, their horses, their traditional way of living. And I'd just say on a positive note, because I always mention this, that Supreme Court decision that was, I think last year or whenever,
yeah,
which was a bit of a change, because there was a case taken by family in Clare, who were on the side of the road, camped for a long time in a certain place anyway. And the Supreme Court acknowledged, though, that in 1922 the laws hadn't changed, that the country had let down people in the traveller community, because those laws, they hadn't looked at those laws about the home. This was the protection of the home, and whether or not a traveller encampment or temporary dwellings could be recognised as a home and then get full protection under the law, under the Constitution, and that. And up to that point, they hadn't had it. Hence they were allowed to be moved. It wasn't recognised as a home. But this Supreme Court decision had luckily recognized the history, which you're looking at history too in your bio studies, and recognized what had happened, that in 1922, the fact that they couldn't just look at the state in isolation, that there had been a history before that, and that understanding the conflicts and everything else would require them to recognize it. And they made a decision that they could recognize that kind of home as a home and give it full protection under the law. And I think that was a good breakthrough. And I think studies like this can make all the difference in us turning that narrative around. So archaeology and history can make this just make a bit more sense as well, And
that's what I would say. So also, Fergus, when you're talking to your philanthropist friends and guys in America, tell them you actually have the good bacteria of the ancient Gaels, Gallowglass warriors, the high kings, and they'll go mental for that stuff. You'll do very well, my friend. Come here. What would you advise, say, traveller organizations, support groups, who are also in the area of mental health and various other health aspects? Would you encourage them to take up more of this research, to get you on board, or to get in contact with your college or university? Because I think you mentioned it. Like I said, I came from a world where there was no formal education, so it took me a very long time to get a grasp of this language and the kind of a essence of behind the words and the jargon and so on and so forth. So there is a big lack of communication. You can put that down to the class system, where the elites, the middle class, and the working class, which is really only segregated education in the first place. People never got the same level of education, so they're on different brave frequencies. So it's very difficult for. A few years ago, I wouldn't be able to talk to you at all. I wouldn't know where to start, how to start, and I would feel all kind of flustered up, and I wouldn't talk. Simple as. It just wasn't there. But now that there is, we're hoping to kind of create that TraVision Foundation, where we can take complex ideas, where they can be broken down by people who actually care about their jobs. Because if you didn't care about your job, you wouldn't be on here trying to explain complex issues to two peasants from Sligo. So we're very grateful for that. But what advice would you give the organizations to encourage them that this is really, really important?
Well, I think it's very important that the children know about it, because I think it's a real tragedy if children start blaming their parents and for being different, and they've got to hear good news stories, and they've got to be encouraged to celebrate the fact that they are different and celebrate all this. I do think, like, you can learn from other marginalized and discriminated groups, whether they be Jews in America or blacks in America. You have to take the game to the others. You need to have your own traveller doctors. You need to have your own traveller teachers. That's not to say it to the exclusion of the non-travellers.
That's right.
But you have to have your own politicians, which you are getting. You have to go and do all these things.
Well, your own philosophy, your own ideologies, and your own.
The very thing you're doing right now, this TraVision, this kind of stuff is terribly important, and it's time consuming, but you have to keep at it. Persistence is what I would suggest, and then you do win over people from the non-traveller community. You do win allies. You do win people who'll get the message. who will realize that they'd been ignorant and not understanding, and who will start to recognize that melting pots don't work and we should be celebrating differences. Then you start to win it over. I think you need to win over television, RTE. Not enough programs on RTE. They're more about, hey, look at these people, they're like freaks. They're not. I don't see enough traveler artists, enough traveler actors. And we need to see more of traveler culture, not faked, not kitsch, just as it is.
Or stereotyped.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And isn't it true? I'm just going to ask this, actually. It's not history, interestingly. Health outcomes, really? I mean, because Bernard has often given us the statistics and everything about that. But we know, isn't it? We understand the gut biome, from what I hear.
Yeah.
I mean, that it's vitally important in even our mental health and everything, isn't it? So if it changes,
it is. I mean, that's the real tragedy of all this.
Yeah.
That, you know, we know that all of this is being absolutely blown away by the social determinants of health. If you're marginalized, discriminated against, and then you have the anticipatory stress on top of that, and all the compounding effects of being marginalized, that dominates, and if your culture is being eroded from left, right, and center, that dominates your health. But now you have this extra thing where the one thing that we found was that there's a microbiome there that actually is good, that is better than what the settled community is. And that's even been taken away by this enforced assimilation. That's, to me, the huge tragedy of all of this. Yes, the microbiome is terribly important for all of this.
Yeah.
And I see it more as a window on your health and on your culture. Yeah. And I think if we were to repeat the study again in a few years' time, I would worry that we might see fewer travelers with this unusual microbiome.
And actually joins together the things we talked about horses and houses.
Oh, yeah.
Living and the rights to those things, if you know what I mean.
This might be a question a bit out there also. I'm not sure it's related to anything. It's just in my head. I don't have to throw it out at you. If, say, the microbiome influences, affects, causes some action for positive mental health or negative, it affects mental health. That's what you're saying. It can play a part in mental health. Is there a reverse of that? Is there where there would be another stream of trauma coming in? People being pillarized and denied their identity and suppressed and oppressed and depression and schizophrenia. Does that affect the microbiome in a negative way?
Yes, it does.
Wow.
And stress alone can affect the microbiome. Now, I wouldn't want to say that this is the only thing, that it dominates everything else, because you don't even need to hear about microbiome if you're actually being marginalized. And I for example, I'm a physician, I'm a medic, I'm a clinician. I've been that for 40 years, but I had never heard the term anticipatory stress until one of the traveler ladies in Cork explained it to me. Now, it's actually in the literature, it's in the scientific literature, but anticipatory stress was the fact that when we asked travelers to come into University College Cork because we wanted to explain the results, I noticed there was a certain hesitancy. And then they explained it to me. So we since then go out to meet the travelers rather than get them to come in. But the anticipatory stress was the feeling that when they go into one of these places like a university and they might meet the groundsman or the porter or the receptionist, it's waiting for the receptionist to suddenly twig, oh, I'm dealing with a traveler. That kind of awkwardness and waiting for that to happen. That might seem like a trivial thing, but I mean, if you're getting that day in, day out, all day long, and that's a profound anticipatory, that's a profound stressor that I would never even known about. I never knew anything about it.
It will actually destroy you. Because not just the university, it's the same for local authorities, it's the same for courts, it's the same with guards. Wherever there's a state institution, you're going to feel it. You can feel it in a rural town. It's like being disenfranchised before your own eyes. You become almost disconnected from reality because it feels like a pressure would be like being underwater without the water. It's that kind of pressure, that stress that comes through you. And all down to childhoods of being othered, being called the dirty tinker, the knacker, the gypsies, the robbers, you thieves, sit there, nobody likes you, so on and so forth. And now, if it was one thing that happened to one person, like if any of this was happening to myself as a person, which a lot of it did, well, then it would only be subjective experiences and so on and so forth. But I grew up in a family where it was happening to siblings. Then I realized it was happening to my parents and it was happening to their parents. And I realized it's happening to my children, it's happening to my grandkids. So it isn't something that we've any control over. It's something that's been happening for generations, where we were actually born into this situation and kind of kept here post 1922. Again, a lack of narrative understanding. Dublin was part of the English Empire, not came with it, not taken over, almost neutral risings with the empire. It was the old Pale. This is not against Dublin or the English or the Protestants or anyone else. We're not into that national silliness. We're not even into labels. We don't give a damn about the labels. We were called every label that could ever be called. This is about 100% or 99.9% genetically related to human beings, and meeting of the minds and meeting beyond the colony, outside of the colonial labels. And if we can get there in that kind of open, plain, conscious mind, then all this becomes kind of common sense. Ireland was colonized. Ireland set up institutions. Ireland never changed them. Ireland educated everybody from an English perspective. And eventually, after generations, we became so othered and disconnected. And a lot of it then started to be born out of guilt, shame. We were reminding people of some kind of trauma that they couldn't even understand themselves. So we're getting sort of even more pushback. Sorry for ranting on again, but all of this is to do with mental health. It is not just the occasional. And actual fact, you'll go sleep with it. You will dream about it. You'll wake up about it because it's on like a humming machine 24/7. And that goes back to the 1960s again, that national airwaves of the others. It was like something where like you were invaded with aliens. Remember that radio show where they burnt it down afterwards?
Yeah.
I forget the name of it. A bit like that, where like that's how it was, and it never stopped. And everyone grew up suspect, and there's always this awkward relationship between travellers and settled. And the only people that can see it are the travellers and the settled, because nobody else can see it. So this psychological construct with traveller, settled, and the whole basis of that was travellers must be Irish who travel. Settled must be Irish who are settled. That is probably the furthest thing from the truth, because like I said, we had lands, we kept cattle, we had go back far enough with a couple of castles, all that kind of stuff. Sorry, ranting on. How are you? Anyway?
I was well. I think all I was going to say was one funny bit was the fact that we use the word settled is a bit of a giveaway in itself. If you know what I mean, like we don't need to use, we wouldn't need to use that word otherwise, because except in a colonial context where there's from the colony's perspective, there was the settled Irish, the good ones, and the non-settled Irish, the wild ones, which was And the further you go back, the more and more of wild Irish there is, and the less and less settled. Yeah. In the old days, they used to call the difference was civil and wild. Yeah,
it's a very good point, and I have to apologize for even using the word settled. I drift into it every now and again. What I would tell you is that the foreign editor, when we published our paper in Nature Medicine, asked us to remove that word, and felt that the best language would be traveller and non-traveller. Now, non-traveller isn't ideal either, because it's defining something as a negative. But
actually, that's
but the language, if you start saying settled, it implies there's something unsettled or something wrong with the other side.
Yeah, and they picked up on that. That's very interesting.
They did, yeah.
To us, we wouldn't even really pick up on it.
Now, in actual fact, she was very good, because just before the paper went to press, before they started printing it, she contacted me to say, have the travellers changed the spelling? Because the printers had changed, taken out the double L. And she felt that was likely to be important. And I said, no, they haven't, put back in the double L. But they were very conscientious, and they recognized the significance of the work. And but again, as I said, that the foreign scientists and the people who reviewed the paper, they were only interested in the science. They had no difficulty with the story or anything, and could see the relevance of this to any marginalized ethnic group, and could see that this is going to happen again and again and again.
It's quite bizarre that it's even actually happening in the first place, because when you take that kind of outside the colony look, and we're looking at the travellers and we're looking at the settled and we're looking at the state and the system, it's quite bizarre that post 1922, the people that would perceive themselves as the normal Irish would actually be using all the same labels the English put on their ancestors. Like itinerant is 16th century English. Tinker is 16th century English. Native, indigenous are 16th century English. So who were the people before that? What was their labels before that?
I suspect also that the non-traveller or settled community after 1922 had such an inferiority complex that they meted out this injustice on the travellers because they wanted to dispel any evidence of our past, and our history was, was
systematically and subconsciously almost.
Yeah,
but
we were in some way embarrassed by the way we were. In fact, now before it's too late, we should be celebrating it.
Ireland can be an important one, as you're saying about the international interest is very interesting as well, because it can be an important one because it's the story. The colonization from the Western perspective, from the English-speaking world perspective, kind of starts in Ireland, and therefore it's one of the oldest, or one of the sources for it. So it probably can be very much connected to what happens next in America, or what happens next in Australia and places like this, where it first happens in Ireland, and yet up to this point, without these kind of studies, hasn't been recognised as such. If you know, which is really interesting.
Fergus, is there anything you'd like to say? Because I lost all my questions anyways, and I was ranting most of the time. But is there anything you'd like to say? Anything in thought? Because I'm sure it is important. I think everything you've been saying is very important to our narrative. It just gives us an extra branch of science, not because we're scientists, but something that we can say, look, this is our narrative. If the scientist comes along and says that couldn't be possible, that's fair enough. But if everything you've been saying is putting everything the travellers have been saying, as you said, the travellers felt different. They knew they were different. They didn't fully understand why, but they knew it. So we know it's there. But is there anything you'd like to add to send a message around the world?
No, except to say, keep doing what you're doing and more. You have to persist, because it isn't just a story of travellers and non-travellers are settled. It's a story of discrimination. It's a story of eroded culture. It's a story of misguided policies. And I'd still use the word ignorance on the part of people who, I mean it in the sense of, if you're not aware, if you don't make yourself aware, you look the other way. And now that travellers are off the roads, it's almost out of sight, out of mind now. But you have to speak up, because before it's too late. And I
bet if we ran a campaign, save the bacteria, whatever, about the travellers, we'd probably get funding.
Well, it's one piece where all I'd say is it's one piece of science that you can and should use because it's real. And science can come to the rescue, at least because it brings facts.
That's it.
I think yourself and Cavieri and Jim Wilson have done wonders, because I won't go into it now because we'll finish up, but it's been a very, very long battle since you're a child and being othered and trying to work out things without a formal education. Then along came modern technology, but that, by then I had some serious psychological damage done to myself, trying to perceive reality and trying to fit into a world that was constantly rejecting me. Like, it didn't make sense where they tell the traveller to get a house, and next year, look, the house was burnt. They tell us get an education, but they put it at the back of the class. They tell us one thing, but it was always contradicted with their actions. So if you can imagine being tossed around in an environment like that the whole time, all your life, it's going to play havoc. So eventually, it was actually Cavaliera's science. And then I said, okay, I don't understand nothing about science. I was still in a pretty bad state. Fell into drink, drugs, and all that kind of stuff. I just wanted out if I could help it. But it popped up, and then I started rooting. I said, okay, what's the science telling us? It's a bit like what we've been saying. We've never left here. We're not different. We're not the outsiders. How would we be the outsiders if we've been here all the time? This kind of stuff. So I went looking for Mr. Foley, who was an archaeologist. So he started explaining to me the Gaelic breakdown, how they labelled the clans, and how there was martial law, and then there was penal laws, then there was a great famine, there was genocide, there was scorched earth, there was people semi-nomadic, and all that started to make sense. So now the science and Dylan's historical framework was matching. But I'm saying, listen to the science. It says A, B, C. That's exactly what we've been saying. So along comes your science, and it's just an extra relief in many ways, that it feels like you finally got here. You finally were right, about all the bonkers stuff that everyone telling you was bonkers in the first place. But it turns out you actually were right. So for me, yeah, you're a bit of a lifesaver.
May I say one
You'll be a
last
legend
thing?
very shortly.
Well, thank you so much. But actually, what I wanted to say was the privilege has been all ours. Myself, my colleagues, we've really enjoyed working with the Irish Travellers, and I want to give a shout out to the travellers, particularly the women, because they were the ones that did most of the work, although it's about 50-50 men and women in our study. But I want to give a shout out to the Traveller Visibility Group of Cork City and to the traveller community of North Cork, because we wouldn't have been able to do the study without them. They bought in to the thing completely. And as I said, that key piece of information about the Housing Act of 2002, I wouldn't have known any of that stuff if they hadn't told me all that. And that helped us design the questionnaire and how we'd actually construct the study. So it was a real piece of collaboration, and
my
it
interest
couldn't have been done without it.
And my interest was actually triggered because Cork University went to a traveller organisation and asked them, would you like to get engaged? So they had come up with an animation. And once I heard ancient bacteria, that was enough for me. I was already hooked on this stuff. So yeah, Dylan, is there anything you'd like to add, say it, finish up with?
No, I'm delighted. That's great. Unusual. It's a nice one, actually, because we're all in accordance in that regard. I have no, makes a change from trying to.
And I would say a full stop overall, that we're coming from a perspective that we don't blame anyone. We're not blaming, we're not out talking about reparations or any other form of nonsense or getting caught up with ethnic and indigenous. We won't put it to one side and allow us a platform, allow us to explain our version of history, the way we see it, without blaming people, and most certainly without carrying any more colonial shame, because we're done with that part also. Fergal, it's been a pleasure and an honour to have you on. You went on.
Likewise. Okay. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Keep well and thank you very much. Dylan, thank you also.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, Bernard.